In the summer of 1967, beneath the scorching Oklahoma sun, a construction crew broke ground on a section of Route 19 that would change one man's life forever. What they found buried in the red clay wasn't just rock and soil. It was something that had been waiting, watching, listening. And when Jack Morrison claimed he spoke with something in the darkness beneath that highway, nobody believed him. But the terror in his eyes told a different story. This is the account of the construction worker who encountered the impossible deep in the heart of Oklahoma, where shadows don't just fall, they stand and observe. Jack Morrison had been working construction for 15 years when he signed on with Patterson Brothers Construction Company in the spring of '67. He was 38 years old, weathered by the sun and hardened by labor, with calloused hands that could operate any piece of heavy machinery the company threw at him. The Route 19 expansion project seemed straightforward enough. Widen the existing two-lane highway to accommodate the increasing traffic that poured through central Oklahoma. The state was growing, and the roads needed to keep pace. The crew consisted of 12 men, most of them locals from nearby towns like Lexington and Purcell. They gathered each morning at 5:30, just as the first pale light crept over the horizon, turning the Oklahoma sky from black to deep purple to burning orange. The foreman, Dale Patterson, was a no-nonsense man in his 50s who ran his crews with military precision. He expected his men to work hard, keep their mouths shut, and get the job done on time and under budget. Jack had always been good at following orders. He kept to himself mostly, showed up on time, and did his work without complaint. The other men respected him for that. He wasn't the type to join them at the bar after shift or share stories about his personal life. What they knew about Jack Morrison could fit on the back of a business card. He lived alone in a small rental house in Lexington. He'd served 2 years in Korea, and he could operate a backhoe better than anyone in the state. The section of Route 19 they were working ran through relatively flat terrain, dotted with scrub brush and red dirt that stained everything it touched. The land had been surveyed months earlier, and the engineers had marked out exactly where they needed to dig. The plan was to excavate along the eastern edge of the existing road, creating space for an additional lane in each direction. It was grunt work, the kind of repetitive labor that made days blur together under the relentless Oklahoma heat. 3 weeks into the project, Jack's crew hit something unexpected. He was operating the excavator, his hands moving automatically over the controls as he pulled bucket after bucket of earth from the trench they were carving into the landscape. The machine lurched suddenly, the bucket catching on something solid. Jack killed the engine and climbed down to investigate, wiping sweat from his forehead with his sleeve. Dale Patterson walked over, his boots kicking up small clouds of dust. They both stared down into the trench. About 8 feet below ground level, the excavator had exposed what looked like stone, not the typical limestone or sandstone common to the area, but something darker, almost black, with a surface so smooth it seemed unnatural. "What the hell is that?" Dale muttered, crouching at the edge of the trench. Jack shook his head. "Never seen anything like it." They called over 2 other crew members, Bobby Hendricks and Tom Reeves, and the 4 men stood there for a long moment, studying the obstruction. The black stone extended in both directions, disappearing into the unexcavated earth. It appeared to be some kind of wall or foundation, though there were no records of any structures ever existing in this location. "Could be an old homestead foundation," Tom suggested, though his voice lacked conviction. Dale pulled off his hard hat and ran a hand through his thinning hair. "Nothing on the survey about any structures. And that doesn't look like anything settlers would have built." The decision was made to expose more of the structure before proceeding. Jack spent the rest of that day carefully excavating around the black stone, removing earth with the precision of an archaeologist rather than a construction worker. By quitting time, they had revealed approximately 30 feet of what appeared to be a wall, perfectly straight, rising about 4 feet in height. The stone was seamless, with no visible mortar or joints. It was as if someone had carved it from a single massive piece of rock. That night, Jack couldn't stop thinking about what they'd found. He sat on his porch, drinking lukewarm beer and watching the sun sink below the horizon. There was something about that wall that bothered him in a way he couldn't articulate. It wasn't just the mystery of its origin or the oddity of its construction. It was something else, something that had crept under his skin the moment he'd seen it. A feeling of being observed, of eyes watching from somewhere he couldn't see. The next morning brought clouds that promised rain, but delivered only oppressive humidity. Jack arrived at the site to find Dale already there, standing at the edge of the trench with a man Jack didn't recognize. The stranger wore khaki pants and a button-down shirt, far too clean for a construction site, and carried a leather satchel under one arm. "This is Dr. Howard Mitchell from the State Historical Society," Dale announced as Jack approached. "He's here to take a look at what we found." Dr. Mitchell was a thin man in his early 60s with wire-rimmed glasses and the cautious demeanor of someone more comfortable with books than people. He climbed down into the trench with surprising agility, immediately kneeling beside the black wall and running his fingers across its surface. Jack watched from above, noting the way the doctor's expression shifted from curiosity to confusion to something that looked almost like concern. After 20 minutes of examination, Dr. Mitchell climbed back up, brushing dirt from his pants. "I can't identify the material," he admitted, his voice carrying a note of frustration. "It's not limestone, not granite, not any sedimentary rock I'm familiar with. The construction technique is equally baffling. There are no tool marks, no seams, no evidence of how it was built or by whom." "So what do we do?" Dale asked. Dr. Mitchell removed his glasses and cleaned them with a handkerchief. "I need to make some calls, bring in some colleagues. In the meantime, I'd advise against disturbing it further until we can determine what we're dealing with." Dale's jaw tightened. Jack had seen that expression before. It was the look of a man calculating costs and delays. "How long?" "A few days, perhaps a week." "We don't have a week. We're already behind schedule." Dr. Mitchell replaced his glasses, his expression hardening slightly. "Mr. Patterson, if this is a significant archaeological find, state law requires." "State law also requires us to complete this highway expansion," Dale interrupted. "I'll give you 2 days. After that, we're removing it and moving forward with the project." Dr. Mitchell opened his mouth to argue, then seemed to think better of it. He nodded curtly, gathered his things, and left without another word. Dale turned to the assembled crew. "We've got 2 days of downtime on this section. I'm moving everyone to the western edge to work on drainage installation. Jack, you stay here. I want someone keeping an eye on the site in case any university types show up trying to halt the project." So Jack became a security guard, spending long hours sitting in the cab of his pickup truck, watching an empty construction site under the harsh Oklahoma sun. Dr. Mitchell returned the following day with 2 younger associates, and they spent hours photographing, measuring, and taking samples of the black wall. Jack watched them work, noting the increasingly animated discussions they had in voices too low for him to hear. On the second afternoon, as the sun began its descent toward the horizon, the academics packed up their equipment and approached Jack's truck. Dr. Mitchell looked tired, and there was something in his eyes that Jack couldn't quite identify. Unease, perhaps, or fear. "We're recommending that the construction be rerouted," Dr. Mitchell said without preamble. "This structure predates any known settlement in this region. We can't determine its age or origin, but it's significant enough to warrant preservation and further study." Jack nodded slowly. "Dale's not going to like that." "I imagine not. But sometimes we find things that are more important than schedules and budgets." Dr. Mitchell paused, then added in a quieter voice, "Between you and me, there's something not right about that wall. The way it's constructed, the depth at which it was buried. It's almost as if someone wanted to ensure it stayed hidden." Before Jack could respond, the sound of approaching vehicles announced Dale's return with the rest of the crew. The conversation that followed was predictable. Dale angry and dismissive, Dr. Mitchell increasingly insistent, both men's voices rising until they were nearly shouting. In the end, Dale made a call to the State Highway Department, and within an hour they had their answer. The project would proceed as planned. The wall would be removed. Dr. Mitchell left with his associates, shaking his head in disgust. Dale gathered the crew and outlined a plan for the following day. They would use jackhammers and explosives to break up the wall, then haul the pieces away as fill material. Simple, efficient, back on schedule. That night, Jack lay awake in his bed, staring at the ceiling and listening to the wind rattle his windows. He kept thinking about what Dr. Mitchell had said. Someone wanted it hidden. But who? And more importantly, why? The questions circled in his mind like vultures, and when he finally fell asleep, his dreams were filled with darkness and the sensation of being watched by something vast and patient. The demolition began at dawn. Jack operated the excavator, while Bobby and Tom worked with jackhammers, their tools screaming against the black stone in a cacophony that echoed across the empty landscape. The wall proved remarkably resistant to their efforts. After 2 hours of work, they'd barely made a dent in its surface, and Dale's frustration was becoming palpable. "Switch to explosives," Dale ordered during a water break. "We're wasting time with this." An explosives specialist named Ray Carson arrived around noon with crates of dynamite and blasting equipment. Ray was an old-timer who'd been blowing things up for construction companies since before Jack was born. He studied the wall with professional detachment, then began placing charges at strategic points along its length. "Never seen stone like this," Ray commented as he worked, his gnarled fingers moving with practiced efficiency. "Density's all wrong. Feels almost hollow in places." Jack felt a chill despite the afternoon heat. "Hollow," Ray shrugged. "Could just be the way it's conducting sound. Or could be there's space behind it. Won't know until we blow it." The crew retreated to a safe distance while Ray made his final preparations. Jack stood next to his truck, watching as Ray connected the detonator and unspooled wire across the construction site. There was a tightness in Jack's chest, a growing sense of dread that he couldn't shake. He wanted to tell Dale to stop, to leave the wall alone, but he knew how insane that would sound. Ray reached the detonator and looked back at Dale, who gave a curt nod. "Fire in the hole." The explosion was smaller than Jack expected, a series of sharp cracks rather than one massive boom. Smoke and dust billowed up from the trench, obscuring everything. The crew waited in silence as the clouds slowly dispersed, carried away by the constant Oklahoma wind. When the air finally cleared, they could see that the charges had done their work. The black wall had cracked and fragmented. Large pieces of it collapsed inward and downward. But what caught everyone's attention was what lay beyond the wall: darkness. Not the darkness of more earth, but something deeper, more absolute. It looked like the wall had been concealing a cavity, a space that extended into the ground in a way that shouldn't have been possible. Dale was the first to move, walking quickly toward the trench. Jack followed, along with the rest of the crew, drawn by the same morbid curiosity that makes people slow down to look at accidents. They gathered at the edge and stared down into what the explosion had revealed. The wall had indeed been hollow, or rather, it had been the outer barrier of some kind of underground chamber. The space beyond the broken wall appeared to be a tunnel or corridor, roughly circular, about 8 feet in diameter, extending downward at a slight angle before disappearing into absolute blackness. The interior walls were the same smooth black material, but here they seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. "What in God's name?" Dale breathed. Ray knelt at the edge, shining a flashlight into the opening. The beam seemed to weaken as it penetrated the darkness, as if the space itself was consuming the light. "I've been in the demolition business for 40 years, Ray said slowly, "and I've never seen anything like this." "Could be an old mine shaft," Tom suggested weakly. "No mine I've ever heard of," Bobby countered. "And why build a wall to seal it?" Dale straightened up, his jaw set in determination. "Someone needs to go down there and see what we're dealing with. We can't just leave an open pit in the middle of a highway project." There was a moment of silence as the crew members avoided eye contact, none of them wanting to volunteer. Finally, Jack heard himself saying, "I'll do it." Dale looked at him with something approaching relief. "Good man. Bobby, get the rope and safety harness from the truck. Ray, give Jack your flashlight and that spare you've got in your kit." 10 minutes later, Jack was being lowered into the darkness. a safety harness around his chest, and 2 flashlights clipped to his belt. The descent was disorienting. The rope twisted slowly as it paid out, making the darkness spin around him. The air grew noticeably cooler as he went deeper, and there was a smell he couldn't quite identify, something ancient and stale. His feet touched solid ground sooner than he expected, maybe 15 feet down. He unclipped the rope and took a moment to orient himself, shining his flashlight around the space. He was standing in what appeared to be a corridor or tunnel, perfectly circular, with walls of that same smooth, black material. The tunnel extended in 2 directions, upward toward the surface where the wall had been breached, and downward into darkness so complete that his flashlight seemed powerless against it. "You okay down there?" Dale's voice echoed from above, distorted and distant. "Yeah," Jack called back. "It's some kind of tunnel. Goes deeper." "How far?" Jack moved forward cautiously, his flashlight beam probing ahead. The tunnel descended at a gentle angle, curving slightly to the left. After about 30 feet, he stopped, something making him reluctant to go further. "Can't tell," he shouted back. "Too dark." That's when he heard it, a sound so faint he almost missed it. A whisper, barely audible, seeming to come from deep within the tunnel. Jack froze, his heart hammering in his chest. He strained to listen, but the sound didn't repeat. Just the wind, he told himself. Just air moving through the tunnel. But he knew it wasn't wind. And in that moment, standing in the darkness beneath Route 19, Jack Morrison realized that some things are buried for a reason. Jack's hands trembled as he gripped the flashlight, his thumb repeatedly flicking it off and on as if the darkness might somehow be less oppressive in intervals. The whisper didn't return, but the silence that replaced it was worse. Heavy, expectant, alive with possibilities he didn't want to consider. He backed up slowly, keeping his light trained on the tunnel's depths, unwilling to turn his back on whatever might be down there. "I'm coming up," he called, his voice cracking slightly. The ascent felt like it took hours, though it couldn't have been more than 2 minutes. When Jack's head cleared the edge of the trench, he found the entire crew staring at him with expressions ranging from curiosity to concern. Dale reached down and helped pull him over the lip, and Jack stood there for a moment, breathing hard, trying to steady himself. "Well," Dale prompted. Jack unclipped the harness with shaking fingers. "It's a tunnel. Goes down deep. Maybe some kind of old storm shelter or root cellar. But—" He trailed off, unsure how to articulate what he'd felt down there. "But what?" "But it doesn't feel abandoned." The words hung in the air, and Jack could see the skepticism on Dale's face, the way the other men shifted uncomfortably. He sounded crazy, and he knew it. But he also knew what he'd heard, what he'd felt in that darkness. "It's probably just an old structure from before settlement days," Dale said finally. "Indian maybe, or early explorers. Either way, it's in our path and it's got to go. Ray, can we collapse it?" Ray scratched his jaw, thinking. Could bring the whole thing down with enough charges. Fill it in with the rubble, pack it with dirt, move on. Be easier than trying to excavate around it. Dale nodded. "Do it. I want this hole closed by end of day tomorrow." The crew dispersed, heading back to their vehicles as the sun began its descent. Jack lingered at the edge of the trench, staring down into the opening they'd created. The darkness seemed to stare back, patient and knowing. He thought about Dr. Mitchell's words, someone wanted it hidden, and now they'd opened it. That night, Jack sat in his kitchen with a bottle of whiskey, drinking more than he should and trying to convince himself he'd imagined the whisper. But the more he drank, the more certain he became that he hadn't imagined anything. Something was down there in that tunnel, something that had been sealed away by people who understood what it was and what it could do. Around midnight, still too wired to sleep, Jack made a decision that would change everything. He grabbed a flashlight from his utility drawer, climbed into his truck, and drove back to the construction site. He wasn't sure what he intended to do. Maybe go back down into the tunnel, maybe just stand at the edge and prove to himself that it was just a hole in the ground, nothing more. The site was deserted, illuminated only by the pale light of a half-moon and the distant glow of Lexington to the east. Jack parked his truck and walked to the trench, the beam of his flashlight cutting through the darkness. The hole they'd blown in the wall looked like a wound, jagged and raw, and the darkness beyond seemed somehow thicker than it had during daylight hours. Jack stood there for a long time, arguing with himself, before finally lowering himself over the edge. He didn't bother with the rope or harness this time. It was a short enough drop that he could manage it. His boots hit the tunnel floor with a dull thud that echoed away into the depths. He stood still, listening. Nothing but his own breathing and the rapid thump of his heartbeat. He moved forward slowly, his flashlight beam trembling in his unsteady hand. The tunnel curved gently downward, and he followed it, counting his steps to maintain some sense of distance. 30 steps, 40, 50. At 60 steps, the tunnel opened into a larger space. Jack's flashlight beam couldn't find the far walls, and when he looked up, the ceiling disappeared into darkness beyond his light's reach. He was standing in some kind of chamber, vast and empty, with that same smooth black material covering every surface. "Hello." His voice echoed strangely, the sound bouncing back, distorted and wrong. And then it answered. The whisper came from everywhere and nowhere, a sound that seemed to bypass his ears entirely and speak directly into his mind. It wasn't English, wasn't any language he recognized, but somehow he understood it. The words formed in his consciousness, like memories of things he'd never experienced. "You've opened the way." Jack spun around, his flashlight beam slashing through the darkness, finding nothing. "Who's there?" "We've been waiting. So long waiting. You've given us voice again. Where are you?" The response wasn't words this time, but something else. A sensation of vast amusement, of ancient intelligence, studying him the way a scientist might study an insect. Jack's flashlight flickered, dimmed, then stabilized. When it did, he saw them. They stood at the edges of his light's reach, tall and impossibly thin, their forms seeming to be made of shadow rather than solid matter. There were 3 of them, or maybe more. It was hard to tell where one ended and another began. They didn't move, but Jack felt their attention on him with an intensity that made his skin crawl. "What are you?" he whispered. "Watchers. Guardians. Prisoners." The words formed in his mind with an undertone of bitterness. "We are what remains when the light dies. We are the dark places between stars. We are the silence after the last word is spoken." Jack's rational mind screamed at him to run, but his legs wouldn't obey. He was rooted in place, unable to look away from the shadow figures that seemed to pulse and shift at the periphery of his vision. "Why were you sealed in here?" "Because we cannot be destroyed. Because we remind them of what they fear. Because in darkness we are truth, and truth is unbearable." One of the figures moved closer, and Jack's flashlight dimmed further. He could see it more clearly now, not a physical form, but an absence of light shaped into something that approximated humanity. Where it should have had a face, there was only deeper darkness, and yet Jack felt it looking at him, into him, seeing everything he was and everything he feared. "You will speak for us," the voice whispered. "You will tell them we are here. You will open the way further." "No," Jack managed to say, his voice barely audible. "No, I won't." The amusement returned, cold and vast. "You already have." Jack's flashlight died completely, plunging him into absolute darkness. Panic finally broke through his paralysis, and he ran, stumbling blindly back the way he'd come, hands outstretched, caromming off the tunnel walls. He could hear, or feel, the shadow figures following, their presence a cold pressure at his back. He found the rope by sheer luck, grabbed it, and hauled himself upward with strength born of pure terror. He cleared the edge of the trench, rolled away from it, and lay there gasping on the red Oklahoma dirt, staring up at the stars that suddenly seemed very far away and very cold. Jack didn't go home that night. He couldn't. Instead, he drove aimlessly through the dark Oklahoma countryside, his hands white-knuckled on the steering wheel, his mind replaying what he'd seen and heard in that underground chamber. By the time dawn broke across the eastern horizon, he'd convinced himself that it had been real, that he hadn't imagined or hallucinated any of it, and that he had to find a way to stop Dale from collapsing the tunnel. He arrived at the construction site early, before the rest of the crew. His truck was already there from the night before, and he could see tire tracks in the dust where he'd parked it. Ray Carson's van pulled up at 6:30, followed shortly by Dale's pickup. Jack waited until Dale climbed out before approaching him. "We can't collapse that tunnel," Jack said without preamble. Dale looked at him, taking in his disheveled appearance, the bags under his eyes, the way his hands shook slightly. "You look like hell, Morrison. You drunk? I went back down there last night. There's something in that tunnel, something alive. We seal it wrong, we could." "Stop." Dale held up a hand, his expression hardening. "I don't know what's gotten into you, but we've got a job to do. Ray's placing charges this morning, and by noon that hole will be filled with rubble. That's the end of it. You're not listening." "No, you're not listening." Dale stepped closer, his voice dropping to a dangerous quiet. "I've got deadlines, budgets, and a reputation to maintain. Whatever you think you saw down there, it's not my problem. You want to keep your job, you get yourself together and get back to work. Otherwise, get in your truck and don't come back." Jack watched Dale walk away, feeling helpless and frustrated. He looked at the other crew members as they arrived, Bobby, Tom, and the others, wondering if any of them would believe him if he tried to explain. But he knew the answer. They'd think he'd lost his mind, and maybe they'd be right to think so. How could he explain shadow figures that spoke directly into his thoughts? How could he make them understand the danger they were in? Ray began placing explosives around 10 o'clock, methodically positioning charges along the tunnel's length and around the chamber Jack had discovered. Jack watched from a distance, a growing sense of dread settling in his stomach. The shadow figures, the Dark Watchers, they'd called themselves, had said he would open the way further. What did that mean? What would happen when the explosives went off? At 11:30, Ray finished his preparations and began herding everyone back to a safe distance. Jack wanted to run, to get in his truck and drive as far away as possible, but something kept him rooted in place. Maybe it was obligation, maybe curiosity, or maybe it was something else, a compulsion planted in his mind during that midnight encounter. Ray reached the detonator and looked at Dale. "Ready when you are, boss." Dale nodded. "Do it." The explosion was massive, far larger than the first one had been. The ground shook violently, and Jack stumbled, catching himself on the hood of his truck. A plume of smoke and dust erupted from the trench, mushrooming into the sky. But beneath the sound of the explosion, Jack heard something else, a sound that shouldn't have been possible, a sound that made his blood run cold. Laughter. Deep, resonant, and utterly inhuman. The dust settled slowly, and when it cleared, the crew stood in stunned silence. The trench was gone, collapsed in on itself, filled with rubble and broken blackstone. But where the wall had been, where the tunnel entrance had stood, there was now something different. The collapse had created a wider opening, and from that opening, darkness flowed like liquid, spreading across the construction site in defiance of the bright Oklahoma sun. "What the hell?" Bobby whispered. The darkness moved with purpose, tendrils of shadow reaching out across the red dirt. And within that darkness, Jack could see shapes moving, tall, thin figures made of absence and void. The Dark Watchers were emerging, no longer confined to their underground prison. Dale took a step backward, his face pale. "Get back to the trucks. Everyone now." But it was too late. The darkness had already surrounded them, cutting off their retreat. The shadow figures stood at the edges of the spreading darkness, dozens of them now, perhaps hundreds. Jack could feel their attention focused on the crew, could feel their hunger and their rage at centuries of imprisonment. One of the figures moved forward, stepping out of the darkness and into the sunlight. It should have been impossible. Shadows can't exist in direct light, but this one did, its form rippling and shifting, but remaining solid. It stopped in front of Jack, and when it spoke, everyone heard it, not in their ears, but in their minds. "You freed us. You broke our chains. For this, we are grateful." "Grateful," Jack managed to say, his voice shaking. "You're killing us?" The figure tilted its head, a gesture that was somehow both human and utterly alien. "We are not killing. We are awakening. We are remembering what it means to exist beyond the walls of our prison. Send them back. Dale shouted, his usual authority cracking into panic. Whatever you did, Morrison, undo it. The shadow figure turned its attention to Dale, and the foreman fell silent, his face going slack with terror. Jack knew what Dale was experiencing, the full weight of that ancient intelligence studying him, judging him, finding him wanting. We cannot go back. We will not go back. The prison is broken. The watchers are free. And now we will watch all of you, as we were meant to do, before they sealed us away. More figures emerged from the darkness, spreading out across the construction site. They moved among the crew members, who stood frozen in place, unable to run or even look away. Jack watched in horror as the shadows seemed to seep into the men, not physically, but somehow deeper, merging with them. We do not destroy, the voice continued. We observe. We remember. We carry the truth of what you are, what you fear, what you hide even from yourselves. This is our purpose. This is why they feared us. Jack felt one of the figures approach him from behind, felt its cold presence settling over him like a shroud. And then it was inside him, not possessing but witnessing, seeing every memory, every secret, every moment of shame and fear he'd ever experienced. It was violation of the most intimate kind, and yet he couldn't resist it. When the shadow finally withdrew, Jack collapsed to his knees, gasping. Around him, the other crew members were doing the same, falling to the ground as the Dark Watchers released them. The darkness that had spread across the site began to recede, pulling back into the collapsed trench. But Jack knew it was too late. They had all been marked, all been changed by what had happened here. The last shadow figure paused before disappearing into the earth. You will tell them what you witnessed. You will speak of us, and they will not believe you. This is the curse of those who see truth, to know and not be known, to speak and not be heard. Welcome to our world, Jack Morrison. Then they were gone, and the crew was alone under the harsh Oklahoma sun, forever changed by what they had encountered beneath Route 19. The aftermath was chaos. Dale immediately called the State Highway Department, trying to explain what had happened while simultaneously downplaying the strange phenomena they'd witnessed. Ray Carson packed up his equipment in silence, his hands shaking so badly he could barely secure the latches on his cases. Bobby and Tom sat in the shade of a truck, staring at nothing, their faces blank with shock. Jack felt different. The encounter with the Dark Watcher had left something behind, a residue in his mind that he couldn't shake. He could feel it there, a cold presence at the back of his consciousness, watching everything he saw, listening to everything he thought. It wasn't controlling him, but it was there, patient and observant, just as the shadow figure had promised. An investigation was launched within 48 hours. State officials arrived, along with engineers and safety inspectors, all demanding explanations for what had gone wrong with the demolition. Dale stuck to the facts. They'd found an underground structure, attempted to collapse it with explosives, and succeeded. He made no mention of the darkness that had spread across the site or the shadow figures that had emerged from the tunnel. When pressed, he attributed any unusual observations to stress and heat exhaustion. The other crew members followed Dale's lead, offering vague statements about strange shadows and unusual sounds, but nothing concrete. They'd all made an unspoken agreement not to speak about what they'd truly witnessed. Who would believe them anyway? And more importantly, what would happen if they told the truth? Would they be sent to psychiatric facilities? Would they lose their jobs, their reputations, their freedom? Jack wanted to speak up, to tell someone in authority what had really happened, but every time he tried to form the words, he felt the presence in his mind stirring, watching with what he could only describe as amusement. The Dark Watcher had told him he would speak and not be heard. It seemed determined to prove itself right. The investigation concluded after a week. The official report stated that the underground structure had been some kind of natural cave formation, possibly a limestone cavern that had been deliberately sealed by early settlers for safety reasons. The collapse was attributed to excessive use of explosives, and Ray Carson received a formal reprimand. The site was cleared for continued construction, and a new crew was brought in to complete the Route 19 expansion. Jack wasn't part of that crew. Dale had quietly let him go, citing budget constraints. But Jack knew the real reason. Every time Dale looked at him, Jack could see the fear in the foreman's eyes, the memory of what he'd experienced when the Dark Watcher had turned its attention on him. None of the original crew stayed with the project. They dispersed to other jobs, other sites, carrying their secret with them into their separate futures. For Jack, the following months were a descent into isolation. He found work with a small construction company in Norman, but he couldn't focus on the job. The presence in his mind was growing stronger, showing him things he didn't want to see, moments of darkness in the lives of people around him, secrets they kept, fears they harbored. It was as if the Dark Watcher had granted him a terrible gift, the ability to see truth beneath the surface, and it was destroying him. He started drinking heavily, trying to drown out the visions and the constant sense of being observed. His landlord evicted him after he fell behind on rent, and he moved into a cheap motel on the outskirts of Norman. His co-workers began avoiding him, unnerved by the way he would stare at them, seeing things about them they'd never spoken aloud. In December of 1967, 6 months after the incident at Route 19, Jack made one final attempt to tell his story. He contacted Dr. Howard Mitchell, the historian who had examined the Black Wall, and asked to meet. They sat in a coffee shop in Oklahoma City, and Jack told him everything: the tunnel, the chamber, the shadow figures, and what they had said and done. Dr. Mitchell listened without interruption, his expression carefully neutral. When Jack finished, the doctor removed his glasses and cleaned them slowly, a gesture Jack had come to recognize as a way of buying time to think. "Mr. Morrison, have you seen a doctor about these experiences?" "I'm not crazy," Jack said flatly. "I'm not suggesting you are. But trauma can manifest in unusual ways. What you went through, finding that structure, being in the collapse, that's enough to affect anyone." "You don't believe me?" Dr. Mitchell sighed. "I believe you experienced something. I believe it frightened you. But shadow creatures that live underground and speak telepathically? That's not something I can accept based on testimony alone." Jack stood up, his coffee untouched. "You examined that wall. You said yourself it was unlike anything you'd seen. You told me someone wanted it hidden. Doesn't that suggest there was something worth hiding?" "It suggests there was an unusual archaeological find that was unfortunately destroyed before it could be properly studied. Nothing more." Jack left without another word. As he walked out into the cold December air, he felt the Dark Watcher stirring in his mind, and he heard its voice one final time. "Now you understand. Truth is a burden only you can carry. This is what it means to be a watcher. To see what others refuse to acknowledge, to know what others will not accept. Welcome to the darkness, Jack Morrison. Welcome to our eternal vigil." And Jack realized, with a despair that settled into his bones like winter cold, that he would carry this burden for the rest of his life, alone and unbelieved, forever marked by what he had found beneath Route 19. The years that followed were a slow erosion of the man Jack Morrison had been. He drifted from job to job, town to town, unable to hold onto anything for long. The presence in his mind never left, and the visions grew more frequent and more intense. He would see shadows gathering at the edges of his vision, tall and still, watching him with patient attention. Sometimes he wondered if they were really there, or if he had finally lost his grip on reality. In 1970, he tried to find the other members of the construction crew, hoping to discover that he wasn't alone in his experience. He tracked down Bobby Hendricks first, finding him working at a manufacturing plant in Tulsa. Bobby agreed to meet for lunch, but when Jack brought up the incident at Route 19, the man's expression closed down completely. "I don't remember it the way you do," Bobby said carefully. "We found some old structure, tried to demolish it. Things got complicated. That's all." "You don't remember the shadows? The figures that came out of the tunnel?" Bobby stood up, leaving his meal half-eaten. "I remember being scared and confused. I remember the heat and the dust. I don't remember anything else, and I don't want to. Leave it alone, Jack. For your own sake, leave it alone." He got similar responses from Tom Reeves and the others he managed to contact. Either they genuinely didn't remember what had happened, or they'd convinced themselves they didn't, burying the memories so deep that they could pretend the incident had never occurred. Jack envied them that ability. He tried to forget, tried to pretend, but the Dark Watcher wouldn't let him. By 1973, Jack had stopped trying to hold down regular employment. He survived on odd jobs and what little money he'd saved. He spent his days researching folklore and mythology in public libraries, searching for any mention of beings like the ones he'd encountered. That's when he first came across references to the Dark Watchers, shadow figures seen in the mountains of California, standing motionless on ridges and peaks, observing travelers from a distance. The accounts were scattered and inconsistent, dating back to the Chumash people who had lived in the region for thousands of years. They spoke of tall, dark figures that appeared at twilight, watching but never approaching, present but never interacting. Some descriptions mention them wearing cloaks or hats, while others describe them as formless shadows that only resembled human shape from a distance. Jack became obsessed with these accounts. He wrote letters to folklorists and historians, sharing his own experience and asking if they knew of similar phenomena in other parts of the country. Most never responded. The few who did treated him with polite dismissal, suggesting he contact mental health professionals rather than academics. In 1975, he made a decision that would define the rest of his life. He returned to the site on Route 19 where they had found the tunnel. The highway expansion had been completed years earlier, and the location where the Black Wall had stood was now buried beneath 2 lanes of asphalt and concrete. Traffic flowed over it continuously, drivers completely unaware of what lay beneath them. Jack stood on the shoulder of the highway, feeling the presence in his mind stirring with something like recognition. He could sense them down there, the Dark Watchers, still present in their underground chamber, still watching, still waiting. The prison they had been freed from hadn't been a physical structure. The Black Wall had been more like a seal, preventing them from extending their influence beyond that space. Breaking the wall hadn't released them entirely, but it had weakened the barrier between their realm and the world above. That night, camped in his truck near the site, Jack had the clearest vision he'd experienced since the original encounter. He saw the Dark Watchers as they had been before their imprisonment, beings that existed in the liminal spaces between light and dark, consciousness and unconsciousness, present and past. They had been observers of humanity, witnesses to every action and thought, carriers of uncomfortable truths that people preferred to ignore. They had been sealed away not because they were evil or dangerous in any conventional sense, but because their presence forced people to confront aspects of themselves they wanted to hide. The Dark Watchers saw everything, every secret, every shame, every moment of weakness or cruelty that humans committed and then tried to forget. They were living mirrors of uncomfortable truth, and humanity had chosen to break the mirror rather than face the reflection. Jack understood then that he had become like them. The presence in his mind had transformed him into a watcher, someone who saw truth beneath surfaces and could not unsee it. He was cut off from normal human connection because he carried knowledge that others refused to acknowledge. He was imprisoned by his own awareness, just as the Dark Watchers had been imprisoned beneath the earth. He spent the following years documenting everything he knew about the Dark Watchers and his experience at Route 19. He filled notebook after notebook with observations, theories, and accounts of his visions. He knew no one would believe him in his lifetime, but perhaps someday, someone would find his records and understand. In 1982, Jack Morrison was found dead in his truck, parked on the shoulder of Route 19, less than a mile from where the tunnel had been discovered 15 years earlier. The official cause of death was heart failure, brought on by years of alcohol abuse and poor health. He was 53 years old. His belongings were few, some clothes, a duffel bag of tools, and 17 notebooks filled with dense handwriting. The notebooks were thrown away by the cleanup crew that cleared out his truck, dismissed as the ramblings of a homeless man with mental health issues. No one read them. No one understood what they contained. But Jack Morrison's story didn't end with his death, because the Dark Watchers remembered him, and in their eternal vigil, they still watch over the place where he gave them voice. Route 19 still runs through central Oklahoma, carrying thousands of vehicles every day. Most drivers never give a thought to what might lie beneath the asphalt, never wonder about the construction projects and buried histories that preceded the road they travel. But some do notice strange things as they pass through that particular section between Lexington and Purcell. People report seeing tall, dark figures standing at the edge of the highway, visible only in peripheral vision, disappearing when looked at directly. These sightings are most common at twilight, that liminal time between day and night when shadows grow long and ambiguous. Local police receive occasional reports from concerned drivers who claim to have seen someone standing on the shoulder, but when officers investigate, they find nothing. There are accounts from construction workers who have done repair work on that section of highway. Some speak of feeling watched while they work, of hearing whispers when no one else is around, of experiencing an inexplicable unease that makes them hurry through their tasks and leave as quickly as possible. Most dismiss these feelings as imagination or nerves, but a few take them seriously enough to request transfers to different projects. The story of Jack Morrison has become local legend, passed around in bars and coffee shops in Lexington and nearby towns. Most versions have been distorted beyond recognition. He's variously described as a drunk who died in a car accident, a crazy man who claimed to have found buried treasure, or a construction worker who vanished mysteriously after discovering something he shouldn't have. Very few people know the real story, and those who do aren't talking. Dale Patterson, the foreman who led the original project, died in 1995 without ever publicly discussing what happened at the Route 19 site in 1967. His son, going through his father's papers after his death, found a single page of notes dated October 1967. The note read simply, "Some things should stay buried. Forgive me, Jack." The son had no context for understanding what it meant. Dr. Howard Mitchell, the historian who examined the Black Wall, published one article about the incident in 1968, titled "An Unusual Archaeological Find in Central Oklahoma." The article described the wall and its strange properties, but made no mention of what happened after the demolition. In private correspondence discovered after his death in 2001, Mitchell admitted to a colleague that he believed there was more to the incident than he felt comfortable publishing, but that without evidence, he couldn't justify pursuing it further. The site itself has been studied by amateur paranormal investigators and folklore enthusiasts, drawn by the persistent stories of shadow figures and strange occurrences. Some claim to have had their own encounters with the Dark Watchers, describing experiences similar to what Jack Morrison reported, feeling observed, hearing whispers, seeing tall figures at the edge of perception. Skeptics attribute these accounts to suggestion and the power of urban legend to shape expectation. But the accounts continue, accumulating over decades. There are too many to dismiss entirely, and they share too many consistent details to be purely coincidental. People who have never heard of Jack Morrison or the 1967 construction project describe the same tall, thin figures, the same sense of being observed, the same whispers in languages they don't understand, but somehow comprehend. In 2010, a graduate student in folklore from the University of Oklahoma wrote her thesis on shadow figure sightings in central Oklahoma. She documented over 50 separate accounts from the Route 19 corridor, spanning 4 decades. She concluded that the area had become what she termed a geographical focus for shadow figure mythology, though she couldn't explain why that particular location had developed such a concentration of sightings. What she didn't know, what no one except Jack Morrison ever truly understood, was that the sightings weren't mythology. They were evidence of something real, something that had been disturbed in 1967 and never properly contained. The Dark Watchers remained, not fully in our world, but not entirely apart from it either, existing in the liminal space created when their prison was breached. They continue their eternal vigil, observing humanity from the shadows, seeing truths that most people prefer to ignore, carrying knowledge that no one wants to acknowledge. They are patient, these watchers, because time means nothing to them. They have already waited centuries. They can wait centuries more. And sometimes on quiet nights, when traffic on Route 19 has thinned to nothing and the Oklahoma wind whispers across the empty highway, people claim to see them. Tall figures standing motionless at the roadside, watching, always watching. Most drivers speed up and continue on their way, choosing not to acknowledge what they've seen, refusing to let themselves believe in the impossible. But a very few, make the mistake Jack Morrison made. They stop. They investigate. They try to understand. And when they do, they sometimes hear the whispers, feel the cold presence settling into their minds, and realize too late that some truths come with a terrible cost. The story of the construction worker who claimed to have spoken with something beneath Route 19 ends here, but the story of the Dark Watchers continues. They are still there, still watching, still waiting for the next person curious enough or foolish enough to seek them out. The wall that imprisoned them is broken. The seal that contained them is breached. And while they may not be fully free, they are far less constrained than they were before that summer day in 1967 when Jack Morrison and his crew broke ground on what should have been a simple highway expansion. Some things, as Dale Patterson wrote in his final note, should stay buried. But once unearthed, once brought into the light, they cannot be buried again. They persist, they endure, they wait. And in the darkness beneath Route 19, in the shadows at the edge of perception, in the liminal spaces between what we know and what we fear, there they remain, the Dark Watchers, eternal and patient, observing all of us with their ancient, unfathomable attention. This is what Jack Morrison tried to tell us. This is what he died trying to make people understand. And now you know his story, the story of a man who opened something that should have stayed closed, who saw something that should have remained hidden, and who paid the price for disturbing forces that humanity had wisely chosen to seal away centuries ago. Whether you believe it or not is your choice. But if you find yourself driving through central Oklahoma on Route 19, especially at twilight, pay attention to the shadows at the roadside. And if you see something tall and dark standing motionless, watching you pass, whatever you do, don't stop. Don't investigate. Don't try to understand. Just keep driving, and be grateful that you still can. Because Jack Morrison stopped, and he never truly left that place again. Before you wander back into the shadows, make sure you hit that like button to keep these legends alive. Subscribe to the channel so you never miss another chilling tale from the dark corners of North American folklore. And whatever you do, activate the notification bell, because the next story might just be the one that keeps you up tonight. Stay curious. Stay brave.